Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear us well. Sorry about this delay. We've had some technical issues, but I hope now everything's okay. Welcome to our little webinar. My name is Milos Kitanovic, and I'm joined today by my colleague Chris Willis. We're coming from the company called Alite International, and we will be talking to you about how we use our methods and our partnerships with cloud providers, namely in this case AWS, to manage and adapt change throughout the big and transformation processes within large enterprises, and using the cloud adoption as one of the drivers for this process. So welcome. Feel free to post questions either in the chat and in the open question sections. We'll make sure to answer all of those questions. Today we also have one of our colleagues, Mr. Marin Rajenovic online, who is our enterprise solution architect. He's also AWS certified solution architect professional. And if you have any technical questions, also he will make sure to answer those as well. And yeah, so after this webinar is finished, all the participants will get access to the video recording within a few business days from today. So I hope you enjoy, and please feel free to ask all the questions you might have. Thanks. I will give the stage to Chris, and he can give the intro about today's presentation.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Milos. As we said on the chat, apologies for the short delay in getting up and running. I think there are a lot of people running webinars at the moment, and therefore the technologies are always a little bit tricky in getting going. But hopefully this will prove a worthwhile hour of your time. And as Milos says, as we go through any questions, please feel free to ask as we go. And between Milos, Marin, and myself, we'll do our best to answer those as we go through. So without further ado, I will step into the slides. If you can't see anything, please just message via the chat room, and we'll try and reset things from there. But hopefully everybody should be able to see the slides now. So 4 core areas that we would like to cover with you today. The first one is an introduction into dynamic transformation, the dynamic business canvas and the relationship with AWS's cloud adoption framework, and then engaging with the dynamic transformation model and using the canvas. And then we'll finish with a Q&A session should there be any questions that we haven't answered at the end of the session. If Milos or I are speaking too fast at any point, or languages are difficult to understand, please drop us a note in the chat forum and we'll try and adjust our approach to make it nice and clear for everybody from there. Okay, so dynamic transformation. Change is hard. I don't think that comes as news to anybody. If you look at the various research according to multiple sources, change fails on average 84% of the time, which is a huge amount. If you look at the world today and pre-pandemic, which I think has highlighted that change can happen even when we least expect it, the world is moving forward at quite an alarming pace. Things like culture, knowledge, experience, attitudes, legislation. If you take certain sectors like finance, legislation in finance has changed hugely in the last 5 years. And not to mention technology, these areas all continue to change at an alarming rate of pace. Yet, if you look at the core model as to how we manage change, that hasn't changed for the last 25 years and is still very much based on the core foundation created by John Kotter and his 8 steps to change, which, whilst it still has a degree of relevance in the marketplace today, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. What we've done at Alite International is created a new proposition called dynamic transformation, which is an iterative, flexible model that allows your whole change program to flex and move as you go through the life cycle of that program, whether it's 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, or even longer, to really understand and adapt to the market changes, the performance changes, and anything else that may happen. So dynamic transformation, what is it? It's a very lightweight consultancy-led partnership, and it's really about creating a baseline for your change program that allows you to understand what happens as you go through. If we look at change as it happens today, 9 times out of 10, an organization will create a change program, whether it's a number of different projects or 2 or 3 large projects. They'll run those projects. Invariably, there will be some performance issues. And at the end of a program, or sometimes in the middle, there will be some sort of post-implementation review or a project mid-project review, where people try to understand the lessons that are learned. But generally, this takes place in relation to scope, into cost, into quality of deliverables. And it doesn't really consider some of the changing attitudes towards change within the organization, whether that's because the commercial position of the business has changed, whether it's because the market dynamics have changed, or various other factors across the organization. And dynamic transformation is really a model that allows you to take all of those elements into consideration. And if you look, and Milos will talk about this as we get into the CAF framework itself, CAF was created to ensure that a high number of cloud adoption projects were successful. And Milos will talk about the stalling point and some of the challenges that people have faced. And as a framework, it's incredibly good. The dynamic transformation framework, when you wrap around that, allows you to take the benefits of CAF and to position it in a much more strategic and much broader sense across the organization. So let me give you an insight as to how we do that at Alite. The dynamic business canvas is really the tool that sits at the heart of dynamic transformation. And it's a blueprint for change that is a living document. And what it does is it maps out the various relationships between the components in a change program. So rather than trying to sort of squint at the screen and look at this small diagram on the right hand side, I'm going to go through the steps in different stages, and we can then have a look at how we go forward from there. But the whole idea of the canvas is that it's a contextually relevant living tool that allows you to understand the impact and changes as you go through a life cycle of a change program. So the first element is the why. 3 core elements: ambition, appetite, and commitment. If you look at any organization, 9 times out of 10, you will have a good understanding of what your goals or what your ambition is, certainly at the start of a program or an initiative. Rarely, though, does an organization have a detailed conversation, a detailed understanding about its appetite, its hunger to achieve that ambition, and also its level of commitment, and more importantly, the relationship between those 3. And I use some examples, having worked in a number of different organizations before, whereby one particular organization wanted to become a very social-led business, so move their brand and their position and their market engagement to a socially driven space. But they were quite a heavily governed organization, and we were able to demonstrate to them that a process that currently took 72 hours and 4 directors to sign off a tweet in Twitter, for example, would need to radically change if they wanted to become a socially driven organization. And in having that recognition, it became very clear that whilst there was an appetite to change and move towards a new ambition, the appetite wasn't there to change that process in its entirety. So by having those conversations and understanding firstly the appetite for achieving that goal, but then more importantly the commitment in terms of, are you going to put funding towards it, are you going to allocate people towards it, it gives you a real sense of qualifying, is your ambition a pipe dream, or is it something that's incredibly attainable? So the first part of the dynamic transformation framework is really to understand those elements and balance those out so that you can move forwards from there. Once we've understood the why, we then start to think about the how. Most organizations just look at project delivery as being it's either agile, it's waterfall, it's a combination of both. It may be lean, it may be scrum, we may use Kanban. They look at the models as opposed to the actual approaches. What we propose is that you need to look at different factors within the organization. The digital maturity, for example, the industry sector, time, importance, skills and capabilities. And we've identified 4 core approaches as to how a project is delivered. So let me talk to those in a little bit of detail. A seeded project is something that has a very small focused start. So in a seeded project, you might have a very low level of maturity, a low appetite for change, but you realize there's some strategic benefit in what you're trying to do. So rather than invest in a big project, you'll do something very small. You'll identify 1 or 2 advocates within the organization, and you'll try and deliver some quick wins. It's a very long tail, slow burn approach, but it's very good at bringing culture and hearts and minds and driving advocacy for change within an organization. So if you go back to Kotter's 8 steps of change, the first thing that he would advocate was that you needed to create a compelling reason for change or some kind of burning platform. Well, I think it's fair to say that in most organizations now, that isn't always the case. Transformation can start for a number of different reasons, and it doesn't always have to be that burning platform. So a seeded approach allows you to initiate a transformation without having to create that sense of urgency, and sometimes try and drive a position with senior stakeholders and C-suite members that they don't necessarily see or understand. The second option is peer, and peer is probably the most common. And that's where you have an existing resource in the organization who has a strong capability, and the organization looks at that individual and says, they're doing a great job on their day job, let's now use them to drive some transformational change as well. So effectively they wear 2 hats. Inevitably what happens is the focus shifts from business as usual onto the transformation. The transformation gets up and running, and whilst that focus is on transformation, business as usual generally tends to suffer. Subsequently, the individual then takes the step off transformation and looks back at business as usual, tries to recover that situation, whilst the transformation then starts to suffer. And you create a pendulum effect across the 2. Now, that doesn't mean that peer is a bad model or a bad approach. It works very well, but there are some constraints around how you use it. So, for example, relief on business as usual targets is an absolute must if you want to use a peer approach. But it's also very cost effective because you already have the resource in the organization to do it. The third approach is incubator. An incubator is whereby you dedicate a group of resource and some funding, and you essentially say, go away and come back when the program is done. You're a protected team with a protected agenda and a protected budget. So we would like you to go away and work out what's going to happen, build it, and then come back when it's done. There was a very large European telecommunications company that did a complete restructure of its technology infrastructure. It was a large program that was in the region of £300 million, and they used an incubator approach. They took an entire team with consultants, they hired a new building, and they basically said, go away and build us a new infrastructure. And once that was proven, they then started to shift the customer base and migrate it from the legacy infrastructure to the new infrastructure. And in terms of maintaining focus from a transformation perspective, incredibly strong. The downside for the incubator is obviously it does require that capital investment up front in terms of the resource and the facilities needed to do it. And then the final piece is the combative piece. And the combative piece is really where you are in a situation where there is a dire need for change to survive. It's very high in collateral damage, but it is incredibly focused and ironically probably the most successful approach for delivering transformational change. Now, what we've discovered in the years that we've been doing this is that transformation programs don't depend on one or another of these approaches. There is quite often a number of different approaches that you would take for different projects within the program. And as we go into dynamic transformation in a little bit more detail, you'll start to see that a project approach could and should change throughout the life cycle. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through. The final element of the canvas is the influence levers. And the influence levers are those aspects of the business that we can control and influence. And so often you'll go into a transformation program and the organization will say, you know, we want to influence the market, we want to influence our competitors, we want to influence the governing bodies. And the reality is that your ability to do that is always compromised. So we're advocating that you focus on those areas that you can control yourself. Within the dynamic business canvas, this is the element that is modular. So some organizations will use a very simple approach like people, process, and technology. The image on your right is used from a model called Polism, which is the operating model canvas, which has been written by Andrew Campbell and a couple of his colleagues. And that looks at the value proposition, organization, locations, information systems, suppliers, partners, management systems. This is the element that in a cloud-centric transformation, you would use the CAF framework. And Miloš is going to talk through the CAF framework in just a minute, and we'll show how that all comes together from there. So it's the dynamic element of being able to adjust things as you go forward from there. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Miloš, who's now going to talk to you about the CAF aspect.
Thanks, Chris. I hope everybody can hear me. So AWS Cloud Adoption Framework, or AWS CAF, is a tool that originates from the experience that the cloud provider, the AWS, had in different cloud adoption journeys in different various geographies. And adopting the cloud or adopting AWS in itself presents many benefits, such as increased business agility, increased flexibility, and of course, reduced costs. However, in order to fully realize these benefits, your staff, your organization may need to acquire new skills, create or update or integrate some of the core processes. And the AWS CAF precisely helps with, the organizations with that, helps them understand how cloud adoption transforms the way they work. And it provides a structure to identify and address the gaps in skills and processes. And to start off, I would like to use the quote by a novelist, Arnold Bennett. And it's actually the quote that AWS itself uses a lot of times when it gives introductions on cloud adoption framework. And the quote says, "All change, even a change for the better, is always accompanied by drawbacks and discomforts." And actually, it illustrates what we are dealing with when introducing change to the organizations. And even a change that is completely well-intended, that is completely beneficial and even revolutionizing, we are affecting the people, and we're affecting how people work, how they behave, how they feel at work, etc. So it brings about a certain level of discomfort accompanying this business change. And the discomfort, more often than not, pushes the process of cloud adoption towards drawbacks. It stalls the process, eventually potentially leading it to failure. Well, AWS CAF aims to address and minimize the drawbacks and discomforts so that the organization can rapidly transform its business with cloud technology. It achieves that by mapping and understanding how the cloud adoption affects the way they work. AWS CAF, as I mentioned, it's a framework originating from AWS experience. It is, however, made available by AWS to everyone. It doesn't really necessarily has to go together with adopting AWS cloud. It can go into other cloud providers. It can be applied in hybrid cloud environments. But of course, since it's based on AWS experience, there is some kind of a bias, or it brings about best results if it's used by AWS, that's for sure. It is based on addressing the challenges that have been reoccurring and re-emerging in their projects with their customers, and it helps organizations exploit the cloud potential with a tailored adoption. And the goal of CAF is to, as we mentioned in the previous slide even, is to maximize the business benefits and minimize the business risks. It does so by identifying actions and specific steps that the organizations can take to move and progress on the cloud adoption journey quickly and help them transform their businesses. So basically, no two enterprises are the same. We have different legacies. We have different challenges to face. All of them come from different beginning states, with different organizations, with different team skills, with different culture, with different business requirements. They have their own unique objectives and goals. They're all definitely looking to rapidly adopt cloud technology and transform their businesses and achieve the goals they want to accomplish, but they face different key decision points and different challenges along the way. So CAF is essentially case specific, and although the strategies to address either legacies or goals or workloads with different security needs, different resilience or performance needs, and different risks, they play a huge role in these cases, but they're not the same in all organizations, and they will be addressed differently and from a different point of view, and from a different point of view, different relevant stakeholders. And CAF begins by identifying these stakeholders, the stakeholders that are critical to cloud adoption, that are going to be affected the most by this change. It categorizes the stakeholders into 6 perspectives that are divided into 2 groups. The groups are business and technical. In business group, the perspectives that are focused on business stakeholders and the business aspects of the cloud. So those are business, people, and governance. In business, we have identified the common roles and common stakeholders, such as business managers, finance managers, maybe budget owners, strategy stakeholders, etc. In people, we have HR people, HR managers, staffing managers, training responsibles, organizational change managers, etc. In governance, the roles that the common roles that are identified are CIOs, program and project managers, enterprise architects, business analysts, portfolio managers. And actually, when it comes to the capabilities in the governance group, what we essentially mean here is to find and to establish the link and alignment between technology and business. How do we align what we're doing from the technology perspective to support the rest of the organization in reaching the goals? On the right-hand side, we have the technical perspectives, and those are focused on technical stakeholders and technical aspects of the cloud. So in platform, security, and operations, we have different common stakeholders and common roles to identify and to talk to when doing the CAF program. For example, in platform, we have CTOs, IT managers, or solution architects. In security, we have chief information security officers, IT security managers, compliance managers, and in operations, we have all the functions that are actually dealing with monitoring different kinds of performance aspects of the IT. So IT operations managers, for example, or IT support managers. These perspectives allow us to understand the cloud adoption from the view of those stakeholders, and CAF tries to understand what the transformation would mean from a person or from the concrete stakeholders' perspective, from their point of view. And each perspective is identified as a set of capabilities that will need to transform along with cloud adoption. And if we talk about capabilities, what we really mean here is identifying what skills and what processes will transform with cloud adoption. The goal here is to actually create an action plan on how to bridge the gaps and reach the level of skills and processes that are needed for that particular stakeholder as they progress with the cloud adoption. The CAF makes sure that these are addressed proactively, not only in these early stages, but as we'll talk about that later, also throughout the cloud adoption journey, to address proactively these gaps and the needs and the discomfort levels for them to be minimized and minimize the risk along the cloud adoption journey. And cloud adoption enables, of course, sustainable advantages, and the AWS CAF can help organizations lay the foundation for their cloud strategy, and it's actually doing that through 4 different stages, let's call them like that. And those are envision, alignment, launch, and realize value. Those are the 4 major stages that CAF relies on. And in envision, in the very beginning, we need to clarify what are the business outcomes that we expect, and we need to align them to the organizational goals. We need to define the measurable success criteria that we will use throughout the journey, and we will need to demonstrate how technology will enable the business outcomes. That's usually where small teams are actually using their AWS accounts to do some proofs of concept and show to the rest of the organization. In alignment, we identify the stakeholders that will be critical to success of the cloud adoption journey, and we need to understand how they will benefit from the cloud, and we need to create a comprehensive action plan that will be updated and renewed throughout the journey. In launch, the organization is ready to execute the cloud projects and start benefiting from the business value of leveraging the cloud. Throughout the process, as I mentioned, we proactively address stakeholders' questions, concerns, and blockers to minimize the discomfort. And finally, in realize value, we adopt the cloud mindset, and we continuously evaluate the cloud strategy and continuously try to find new projects, new units to migrate to the cloud. When we translate the 4 principles from the previous slide into general stages of cloud adoption, we also see that organizations typically follow a 4-stage journey as they adopt cloud. They begin with the cloud project, usually driven by a curious team who set up an AWS account and use it to run some demonstrations and some POCs. After that, they'll have learned things from the project stage that will help them form some kind of a foundation that is required to manage other applications in the cloud. And their success from the first stage it helps the other teams transition a few production applications to AWS. Next, they embrace the cloud as an essential capability, and they migrate the majority of their IT estate maybe to the platform. And finally, they will be all in on cloud and focus on optimizing the infrastructure and becoming more sophisticated in their use of things like automation, auto-scaling, orchestration, using different kinds of instances, etc. But unfortunately, when it comes to cloud change projects, 70% of them are left to stall. This is caused usually by shortfalls in the change management of cloud programs. And unfortunately, some of those cloud programs never recover. And from our experience, our observation is that organizations that do not succeed with the operational integration, especially with their change management components. They see their cloud programs stall and fail to achieve their desired outcomes. What we also observed in our change management projects is some different categories of why change fails. First of all, the reasons for change, or the goals or the objectives of the company, were not so clearly defined. The timing or the speed of change was misjudged. The communication before, about, or around the change was poor. There was no alignment. And finally, and most importantly, from the CAF perspective, is that usually capabilities and skills and the processes that need to evolve with the cloud are often overlooked. But we can, fortunately, we can use CAF to think holistically about cloud adoption and help the organizations stay on the right path and build a plan that will not only be pragmatic, but that will help them to take a brave step to move the operations to the cloud. Again, starting with the cloud adoption, we need to clarify the business outcomes and align them with organizational goals, and demonstrate early how technology will enable these business outcomes. After that, after we identify the critical stakeholders, we need to foster from these early stages the stakeholder consensus and alignment, and that's crucial for this value curve to have such a quick rise this early in the process. And that's also backed up by the comprehensive action plan that we will show in one of the following slides that CAF relies on to immediately get the risks out of the way. When we migrate, this is where we are ready to actually start working in the cloud all in, and continue to proactively address the stakeholders and their questions and adapt the action plan. And this basically speaking about the value. Once operational, the organization is definitely able to recognize the value that cloud brings and continually evaluate new initiatives or new optimization opportunities or new innovation opportunities even, and to try to test them, to try to be quick in exploring all the possibilities. So finally, the main question before the journey starts is, how do we get those stakeholders aligned on the cloud adoption? How do we help them identify the gaps? How do we help them define what new skills and what new processes they will need in order to be successful at cloud adoption? Well, in CAF is delivered as an on-site series of workshops by the AWS subject matter experts, and it tries to boil down basically these gaps to the action plan. And the plan focuses on addressing the imminent challenges across the capabilities and across stakeholders. It's actually formed on a couple of weeks basis, addressing only the most prioritized ones. And as you can maybe see in the screen, some of them are marked with a badge sign, some of them are marked with these process sign, and the ones marked with the badge sign actually refer to the actions that are connected to some new skills that need to be acquired, and the other ones refer to processes that need to be updated. And finally, in the following slide, let's see the usual process on how the CAF action plan is generated and populated. How do we start identifying and mapping the actions? Well, step number one, we identify your challenge and desired outcome. This is done by getting the stakeholders together, talking with people, and trying to understand the desired outcomes that the customer is trying to achieve. And then we also try to identify the challenges that they're facing. In step 2, we use the common roles from the CAF framework and capabilities to identify the exact precise stakeholders that we need to talk to in more detail and engage with them in a conversation to break down goals from step 1 and challenges from step 1 and give them context. In step 3, we determine or we define in detail the challenges and concerns and write them down. In step 4, we determine whether they are related to whether they are addressable by developing new skills or updating and integrating some processes. In step 5, the activities are documented in the action plan, and it's very important to make sure that every concern is addressed by an appropriate action. In step 6, we prioritize them, break down the plan into a more short-term looking, and start addressing the gaps immediately. That's it about the introduction to CAF. I want to hand over back to Chris, and he will show you how we integrate this into the broader context of dynamic transformation. Thanks.
Thank you, Milos. Very comprehensive overview on the CAF piece there. So as Milos said, what I'm going to do is talk to you about how CAF fits into the dynamic transformation framework and how we use some of the levers, and in particular, building on some of the points that Milos raised around why those cloud projects are left to stall and how the Canvas and the dynamic transformation framework can help address those scenarios. So we start off by running a very intense 5-day engagement with a client. And essentially what we're trying to do in those 5 days is create a baseline of that canvas. So the first day is very much focused on understanding the why, that relationship between the ambition, the appetite, and the commitment. The second day is looking at the what, so that operating model, and in particular the CAF framework and the relationship between the CAF framework and other elements in a change program. Then the how, so the various different approaches, whether we're going to use a combination of seeded, peer, incubator, combative, or how we're actually going to get the rubber on the road. Then we have a reflection day, and the reflection day is really important because it's not until you put facts and figures and information and consequences of change onto paper that people really understand the implications of some of the things that may be coming further down the road. And it's a great opportunity to qualify and validate that appetite and that commitment level in achieving those ambitions. Finally, on day 5, we'll then go through a refactor process, align and create the baseline for the canvas and the communication plan as to how we're going to move forwards. There are 2 types of canvas that you can create. This is a Canvas Pro. I'm not going to go into detail. Obviously, there's a lot of information on the screen. But essentially, the difference between the Canvas Pro and the Canvas Lite is really the level of granularity of information that you can have under the various sections. So in Canvas Pro, for example, your ambition, you wouldn't necessarily just have your objectives, but you might have your key results as well. So using the OKR model. Your appetite would be mapped directly to your influence levers. So in the same way that with the CAF framework, you would have the 6 key stakeholder groups as your influence levers, you would also list those in your appetite and then high, medium, low against those. In the Canvas Lite, we simply just look at, is there an appetite, yes or no? Is there a commitment, yes or no? And what are the top line objectives? So once you've created your baseline, what you then do is you're able to actually use the canvas in anger. And as we talked about earlier, CAF is a fantastic step forward in delivering cloud transformation and cloud change because it brings in all of the other considerations that Milos talked around the different stakeholder groups and how you take a cloud initiative and turn it into something more than just a technology piece because its implications are far and wide across an organization. The dynamic transformation framework and the canvas allows you to build further on that by taking other factors into consideration. So whether that's performance of projects, whether it's external factors, whether it's overperformance of a project and how do you accelerate activity. It allows you to drive some of that activity forwards. So what we'll do now is we'll step through a couple of examples as to how the canvas could work in real life. So let's say, for argument's sake, we've created a baseline canvas here. We have a cloud migration project that sits in the center, and that ties into an objective around digitization to drive the business forwards. You can see that we have a good level of commitment towards it, and there is an appetite. So if I just move forward so we can actually highlight the pathways that I'm talking about. So our cloud migration project touches, in this instance, virtually all of the elements of CAF. We've decided to go for a seeded approach because in this particular scenario, we are testing the water about moving to cloud. We may be a heavily regulated organization where there are some nervousness about data in the cloud, or a general low level of maturity and naivety about how cloud works. So we recognize that it's a strategy that we should explore, but we're going to try it small and see how it goes. And in this scenario, we kick the project off. We recognize that we've got some appetite, some commitment, but not a massive amount to really sort of drive it forward as a hero project in the organization. As we go through on a weekly, fortnightly, monthly basis, depending on the cadence of your organization, these projects in the center line here report their KPIs within that cadence. And the dynamic transformation framework has tolerances around those projects. So whether you're overperforming or underperforming, if you hit one of those tolerances, then the canvas will give you a notification to say you need to review this project and the pathways. So let's take that a step further. We're in a situation where this project is overperforming, and actually we're starting to see benefits much sooner and far deeper than perhaps we understood. And again, that could become as a result of the low level of maturity that we had when we first started this cloud project. The project is overperforming. That has triggered a review at the steerco or executive level. And in recognizing the benefits that we're starting to see, our appetite has increased. And as a result of our appetite increasing, we're now going to commit some people and some money so that we're able to accelerate our activity. Now, the canvas and the dynamic transformation recognizes that actually with that level of appetite and that level of commitment, seeded is not the best approach. That is not going to maximize that return on investment, and it's not going to maximize the benefits to an organization. So the canvas makes the recommendation that actually you should change your project approach from being a seeded project to an incubator project, therefore giving it dedicated resource, dedicated funding, and allowing you to achieve a far greater set of outcomes in a shorter time frame, driven off the back that the original project approach was performing at a rate greater and delivering benefit greater than initially anticipated. So that's just one example as to how you can see the canvas and the dynamic transformation start to change. If we go back to our situation here, where this project is overperforming and we're recognizing that, in the current world, overperformance in a project is very rarely reported, and it's very unusual for an organization to change its approach to maximize that overperformance. So dynamic transformation allows you to actually make those changes in the moment based on near real-time information and the reporting of the project to maximize that opportunity. You know, if you were to fast forward 6 months down the road and at the end of the program do a review and say, well, you know, it was going really well, we could have achieved more quicker if we'd have changed our approach. That's great, but that doesn't actually help you achieve that goal. Whereas the dynamic transformation framework allows you to act on those insights and adopt those recommendations and make those changes as you move forwards. What it also allows you to do is look at various elements. So you can see from a broader spectrum if you look at all the different projects. And CAF works really well because you can take a project like new markets or frameworks and governance, and you can map it against the CAF framework to understand how cloud-centric is your thinking and how does it affect the different stakeholder groups within that CAF framework. But you can also use the Canvas and the dynamic transformation framework to start to understand, well, actually, we've got a huge amount of projects that have a dependency around the business aspect of the CAF or the governance aspect of the CAF. And as an organization, how well equipped are we to be able to handle that volume of change in that functional area, given what we're trying to do? So it's really about taking the CAF framework and allowing you to amplify your understanding and also adapt your approach as you go forwards, given the organizational changes that may come through. And if we look at the current situation we're in with the pandemic now, dynamic transformation allows you to recognize where you need to focus your efforts, but not necessarily turn the activity off on other projects and programs. So from a cloud perspective, you may look at certain things like your infrastructure and your capability and the information you need to support home working or distance working, but recognize that there are other initiatives that are still strategic, but you may want to just keep ticking over in the background. So you may move a lot of activity to a seeded project where the investment is lower, the resource demand is lower, but once the world returns to a normal state, you're able to recover some ground and accelerate quickly rather than having stopped it entirely and having to move forwards. So just to recap, successful change and transformation is hard. The dynamic transformation framework is really designed to be that iterative model and build on the foundation that CAF has created, certainly in the cloud space, to allow you to recognize and give an organization the strongest chance of success based not just on the elements that sit within the CAF framework, but performance of initiatives, external market factors, whether they are political, economic, social, technical, legislative, or in the current situation, environmental changes that may impact the way that we're working. And with that, and 5 minutes to spare, apologies that we were a little late in starting, but that concludes the content that we have. I would like to open up the floor for any questions. Okay, so we've got one question: how digital transformation is affecting the customer experience? It's a really good question, and there are a number of different ways that you could answer this. Customer experience has always been seen as a differentiator in the marketplace. And I think until recently, there was a somewhat rose-tinted view that if your customer experience was good enough, people would come to you no matter what. And I think the reality of what we've seen is that it's a combination between the product or service that you're offering and the ability to provide that service as much as the experience itself. So as you're going through, customer experience needs to be a key element, a key understanding, a key factor, but it's not necessarily the holy grail that perhaps some people see it to be. If you look at the financial sector, for example, in consumer finance, it's very much a value-driven market. So having a great customer experience is not necessarily going to make somebody shift their mortgage from one provider to another if the rate isn't competitive. So there still has to be that relationship between customer experience and product. What we're seeing with digital transformation in particular is that consumer expectations are much greater. If I can buy one click on Amazon, why can't I buy one click everywhere else? So there are some important factors there, but it's not necessarily the holy grail of digital transformation. Milos, one for you.
Yeah, we have another one. Well, actually, in the action plan or AWS CAF, is actually used to avoid creating mistakes, common mistakes when embarking on the cloud adoption journey. And in creating it, what we should definitely avoid is not documenting even the slightest concerns when speaking with stakeholders. It's usually those are if you remember from the presentation, it's there are several common groups that lead to change programs to fail, and what we should definitely pay attention to is even the slightest concerns and slightest discomforts to be documented and put into the action plan. Of course, we will need to prioritize the ones that are with the highest impact, so to say, and address them immediately. But the ones that are with less impact will stay down the line in the action plan, but will be addressed somehow. That's one of the mistakes when people overlook. Okay, then think that okay, with this one is we can live without addressing that. No, that's one of the most common things.
Thanks, Milos. Any other questions at this point? Conscious that we were a little bit late in starting and we are at our 2:30 stop. But we'll just give you the option for any other questions before we close this out. And as Milos mentioned, the recording will be available within the next few business days. So we'll make sure that the link gets sent out to all of you guys as well.
Yep. Doesn't seem like we have any new questions.
No, I think we're good. So with that, thank you ever so much for your time. I hope that you are all keeping safe in the current situation and the challenges that we're facing, as businesses in our various sectors are presenting some great opportunities and not having too much of a detrimental effect. So thank you ever so much for attending. Stay safe, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.